Have you ever pushed yourself through the toughest challenge you've ever faced, only to discover that the one person you counted on wasn't there when you finally made it through? That's exactly where my story begins. My name is Ethan Parker. I spent more than 3 decades working as a construction supervisor. I was a husband until cancer stole my wife Megan, and I'm the father of one incredible daughter. For the last 3 years of my career, though, I carried another title that I never wanted to admit out loud. I was an alcoholic. No excuses, no softer word for it, that's simply the truth. I had just turned 63, and on a cold January morning I found myself standing outside Pine Ridge Recovery Center in Indianapolis, waiting for the ride that never came. I'll explain how that happened in a minute. First, let me tell you about that morning. The cold wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of weather that came with blizzards or heavy winds. It was the steady Midwestern kind that quietly slipped through every layer of clothing until it settled deep into your bones. It didn't fight you. It simply reminded you that it had been around long before you arrived and would still be there after you were gone. At exactly 10:58 that morning, one of the staff members handed me a plain manila envelope, wished me luck, and walked away with a warm smile that felt genuine. I stood there in the lobby staring inside the envelope even though I already knew what I'd find. There was my worn leather wallet, a Father's Day gift from my daughter Emily 4 years earlier, back when holidays still felt joyful instead of painful reminders of everything I'd lost. My house keys rested beside it. There was also my cell phone, completely dead after weeks without a charger, and exactly $46 in cash. For $20 bills? No. 2 20s, a 5, a single dollar bill, and loose change I couldn't bring myself to count. Somehow, standing there counting coins felt like the saddest thing a 63-year-old man could possibly do on a Thursday morning. $46. That was all I had waiting for me after 6 weeks of fighting harder than I had ever fought for anything in my entire life. Those 6 weeks weren't peaceful or comfortable. They weren't some relaxing retreat where people talked about feelings over coffee and walked away cured. Recovery didn't work that way. I spent nights sweating through sheets until the nurses quietly changed the bedding before sunrise without ever making me feel ashamed. I sat beside men who openly cried because they'd missed birthdays, baseball games, graduations, and years of their children's lives that could never be given back. I never judged a single one of them because I understood every ounce of that regret myself. For the first time since my wife died, I finally talked about her honestly. I talked about Megan's laugh, the way her shoulders always shook before any sound came out, almost like her happiness needed a second to catch up with itself. I talked about the little morning ritual she had with making coffee, treating an ordinary pot of coffee like it deserved patience and care. Most of all, I talked about what happened after we buried her. People think a house becomes empty after someone dies. That's true, but it also becomes something else entirely. Every room feels unfamiliar, even though nothing has physically changed. The air itself seems different, like the whole place forgot how to breathe. At first, I drank because I missed her. Later, I drank because I couldn't imagine living inside the life she'd left behind. Eventually, I wasn't drinking to numb grief anymore. I was drinking because I no longer remembered how to function without alcohol. It happened so gradually that I barely noticed the distance I'd traveled until getting back seemed impossible. Rehab forced me to face every ugly piece of that truth. So when I stood in the lobby watching the automatic doors slide open again and again while the parking lot remained empty, the disappointment cut far deeper than anyone else could have understood. Emily had promised she'd be there. I checked the clock. 11:05, then 11:18. Then 11:43. She'd known my release date for weeks. During our last phone call she'd even promised, "Don't worry, Dad. I'll be there before you walk outside." I believed her. A young man barely 25 left the building a few minutes later. His mother rushed across the parking lot before he could even reach the sidewalk. She wrapped both hands around his face, crying so hard she could barely speak, like she'd spent every day counting down until that exact moment. I smiled for them. Then I looked back toward the entrance and realized no one was coming for me. Another patient, a woman close to my age, walked out carrying the same envelope I held. Our eyes met for only a heartbeat, but we understood each other without exchanging a single word. A taxi arrived for her. Mine never did. My phone was dead. I had $46. And January wasn't getting any warmer. By 11:50, I finally accepted what I had been trying not to believe. Nobody was coming. I slipped the envelope under my arm, pulled my coat a little tighter, and stepped outside. The cold hit me instantly, sharp enough to make my eyes water. A few weeks earlier, during one of our free evenings at Pine Ridge, I'd quietly searched the city bus routes on the shared computer in the recreation room. I hadn't wanted to admit why I was looking them up, but some cautious part of me had prepared for this exact possibility. The nearest stop was about 4 blocks away. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. I started walking. I had barely taken a dozen steps when I heard a voice behind me. Ethan Parker. It wasn't asked like a question. Whoever said it already knew exactly who I was. I turned around. A man stood beside a dark SUV parked near the curb. He looked to be in his early 40s, wearing a charcoal overcoat that fit like it had been tailored just for him. Everything about him seemed calm and deliberate, from the polished shoes to the steady way he held eye contact. There was something strangely familiar about his face. Not enough for me to place it immediately, but enough to make old memories stir somewhere in the back of my mind. Then it clicked. Daniel. His smile spread across his face, still slightly crooked on one side, exactly the way I remembered. I was hoping you'd recognize me, he said. I just stared at him. The last time I'd seen Daniel Brooks, he was 23 years old, carrying every possession he owned in a ripped duffel bag and sleeping on the couch in my house after life had knocked him flat. Back then, he'd lost his parents within months of each other, dropped out of college because he couldn't afford tuition anymore, and nearly ended up living in his truck. Megan wouldn't hear of it. She cleaned out our guest room, made fresh sheets, and cooked enough dinner every night so he never felt like he was imposing. She never treated him like charity. She treated him like family. That's simply who she was. The confident attorney standing in front of me barely resembled that exhausted young man. You've changed, I finally managed. So have you, Daniel answered gently. There wasn't any judgment in his voice. Just honesty. How long have you been waiting? I asked. A little under an hour. It's freezing out here. I figured it would be. Then he reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a stainless steel thermos. Still drink your coffee black? I couldn't help smiling. You remember that? I remember more than you think. I unscrewed the lid and took a slow sip. It was hot. Fresh. Exactly how I liked it. For a few quiet moments neither of us said anything. 25 years had passed since we'd last stood together, and somehow the silence didn't feel awkward. It felt comfortable. Eventually I looked down at the cup. Megan's gone. Daniel lowered his eyes for a second. I know. I'm sorry I wasn't there. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence that followed. Some losses deserve room to breathe. Finally he reached into the SUV, picked up a brand new cell phone still sealed in its box, and handed it to me. I got this for you last week. I frowned. Last week? He nodded. I've actually been preparing for this for quite a while. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. What do you mean? His expression became noticeably more serious. Ever since your son-in-law, Brian Mitchell, entered the picture. The name landed like a rock in still water. Brian. My daughter's husband. The man who had shaken my hand at their wedding and promised he'd always look after her. What about Brian? Daniel studied me for a long moment before answering. I'd rather explain everything once we're somewhere private. Is it really that bad? He opened the driver's door. Get in, Ethan. There was something in his voice that told me this wasn't speculation. This was certainty. During rehab I'd learned one lesson that mattered more than almost anything else. You can't always control what happens to you. You can only control what you choose to do next. So instead of letting panic make my decisions, I climbed into the SUV. The heater hummed softly as Daniel pulled away from the recovery center. For several blocks neither of us spoke. Then he placed a thick folder between us. It was neatly organized with colored tabs sticking out from every section. Someone had spent weeks putting it together. Maybe months. Daniel rested one hand on the steering wheel before speaking. Brian filed paperwork giving himself financial authority over your affairs 7 weeks ago. I blinked. That's impossible. It should be. He looked at me briefly before returning his attention to the road. The signature isn't yours. I opened the folder. Every page made my chest feel a little heavier. Bank statements. Property records. Transfer receipts. Documents carrying a signature that looked almost identical to mine. Almost. He started moving money during your first week in treatment, Daniel continued. Small amounts at first. Then larger ones. Everything was done carefully enough that most people wouldn't notice until it was too late. I kept turning pages in complete silence. 30 years of savings. Investment accounts. Retirement funds. Money Megan and I had spent decades building together. All disappearing piece by piece. This can't be real. I wish I could tell you it wasn't. Only one question mattered. Does Emily know? Daniel answered immediately. No. I looked at him. She thinks you extended your stay. Brian convinced her that you called and asked for extra time because you weren't ready to leave treatment yet. I closed the folder. For the first time that day, I felt relief instead of heartbreak. My daughter hadn't forgotten me. She'd been lied to by the man she trusted more than anyone else. I leaned back in my seat, staring through the windshield as the recovery center disappeared behind us. Brian thought he'd removed the biggest obstacle standing between him and everything I'd worked my entire life to build. He believed I was weak. Broken. Easy to erase. He had no idea that I was sitting beside the one man who remembered exactly what my family had done for him decades earlier. And he certainly had no idea that the man he thought he'd left stranded in a parking lot had just become the biggest problem of his life. Daniel didn't take me to a hotel or some expensive place downtown. Instead, he drove across the city to a quiet apartment complex that blended into the neighborhood so well you could pass it every day without ever noticing it. This will be home for a while, he said as he unlocked the door. The apartment was simple but comfortable. The furniture wasn't fancy, yet everything was clean and organized. The refrigerator was stocked with groceries, fresh fruit, milk, eggs, sandwich meat, and enough food to keep me going for at least a couple of weeks. A handwritten note rested on the kitchen counter. Don't contact Emily yet. Trust me. We'll talk Friday. I stood there reading those words several times before setting the note back down. The urge to call my daughter was almost overwhelming. I wanted to hear her voice. I wanted to tell her I wasn't missing, that I hadn't abandoned her, and that none of what Brian had told her was true. Instead, I walked to the refrigerator. Recovery had taught me something important during those 42 days. Not every feeling deserves an immediate reaction. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is wait. So I made myself a turkey sandwich, poured a glass of water, and sat quietly at the small kitchen table. Outside the window, snow drifted across the parking lot. For the first time in years, my mind wasn't racing toward a bottle. It drifted toward Megan. Whenever life became painfully quiet, that's where my thoughts always ended up. I remembered how she'd hum while cooking dinner. How she'd straighten picture frames that weren't crooked. How she'd always make enough food for unexpected guests because, as she'd often say, you never know who might need a place at your table. Daniel had been one of those people. Now he was returning that kindness in a way neither of us could have imagined all those years ago. That night I went to bed before 10. It wasn't because I was tired. It was because I finally had something I'd been missing for a very long time. Purpose. Friday morning my phone rang at exactly 8:15. "How are you holding up?" Daniel asked. "I actually slept." "That's a good sign." I didn't think I'd ever say this, but waking up sober feels strange. "It'll feel normal eventually." There was a short pause. "I need you downtown Monday morning. We've got a lot to go through." I laughed. "You remember I don't exactly have transportation." "I've already handled that." "You have?" "A driver will pick you up at 8:30. Of course he had. His law office occupied the 15th floor of a modern glass building overlooking downtown Indianapolis. The receptionist greeted me by name before I even introduced myself. A few moments later a woman named Karen brought fresh coffee and quietly placed a legal pad in front of me. She'd clearly worked with people facing difficult situations before. She didn't waste words. Daniel walked in carrying another folder. This one was even thicker than the first. He sat down across from me and folded his hands. "I've spent the last 6 weeks digging into Brian's financial history." I nodded. "What did you find?" "Enough to destroy him." He opened the folder. First, the power of attorney he filed is fraudulent. The notary listed on the paperwork lost his commission years ago. I stared at him. "So the entire document is fake?" "Every bit of it." He slid another page toward me. "3 of your bank accounts have already been emptied." I felt my stomach tighten. "And this one?" He pointed to another statement. It was the savings account Megan and I had opened shortly after we got married. We used to joke about it, calling it our someday fund. Someday we'd travel. Someday we'd buy a lake cabin. Someday we'd spoil future grandchildren. That account had once held nearly $50,000. The balance now read $14. 62 ***. I couldn't speak. I simply stared at the number. Daniel gave me time. Finally he broke the silence. "There's something else." His voice had changed. It wasn't louder. Just heavier. "This isn't Brian's first time." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "He married before." That caught me completely off guard. His first wife was named Laura. Her father was a retired mechanic living alone after his wife passed away. Daniel opened another section of the file. Within 18 months Brian had control of the man's finances. I already knew where the story was heading. He stole from him too. Daniel nodded. Over $300,000. What happened? Laura believed Brian's explanations until it was too late. And her father? He lost almost everything. The room fell silent. Daniel leaned back. Eventually Laura discovered enough evidence to leave him, but proving fraud years later became almost impossible. By then the money had disappeared through shell companies and carefully layered transfers. So he got away with it. He thought he did. Daniel looked directly at me. "I tracked Laura down 2 weeks ago." My eyebrows lifted. "You found her?" She never stopped hoping someone would. For the first time since opening the folder, I felt something other than anger. Hope. Real hope. So we're not the only ones. No. He closed the file. We're just the ones with enough evidence to finally connect every piece. I leaned back in my chair, trying to absorb everything I'd learned. Brian hadn't targeted me because of who I was. He'd targeted me because I was grieving. Because addiction had made me vulnerable. Because he believed my daughter trusted him enough to never question his decisions. He hadn't chosen me personally. He'd chosen my circumstances. Predators don't invent opportunities. They wait for them. Daniel folded his arms. There's one more thing. What is it? I don't want you contacting Emily. I know. I mean under any circumstances. I sighed. That won't be easy. I understand. She probably thinks I disappeared. I know. She probably thinks I started drinking again. Daniel nodded slowly. And Brian is counting on exactly that. I looked out through the office window at the busy streets below. People hurried to work. Traffic flowed normally. The city kept moving. Nobody outside that office had any idea my entire life had been quietly dismantled over the past 2 months. I want my daughter back, I said quietly. You will. I want my life back. You'll get that too. And Brian? Daniel's expression never changed. We're not going after him with anger. What then? Facts. He smiled faintly. The truth is much harder to escape than revenge. For the first time since leaving rehab, I realized this wasn't about getting even. It was about making sure a man who had spent years stealing from grieving families would never have another chance to do it again. Over the next several weeks, my life settled into a routine that looked painfully ordinary from the outside. Every morning I woke up around 6, brewed a pot of black coffee, and sat by the apartment window while the city slowly came to life. After breakfast, I read through the recovery materials I'd brought with me, took long walks around the neighborhood, and reminded myself that staying sober was still my first priority. None of it felt exciting. That was exactly the point. For years I'd lived from one emotional crisis to the next. Now I was learning that peace could feel unfamiliar when chaos had become your normal. Daniel, meanwhile, was anything but idle. Every few days he called with another update. Another document. Another witness. Another piece of Brian's carefully constructed life falling apart. One Tuesday afternoon I met him back at his office. He closed the conference room door before speaking. He's getting nervous. I looked up from my coffee. What makes you say that? He expected you to call Emily by now. I've wanted to. I know. He expected you to show up at the house. I've wanted to do that too. Daniel smiled slightly. And because you've done neither, he's starting to wonder what you know. That surprised me. I thought he'd be relieved. He would have been if you'd reacted emotionally. Instead, Daniel spread several printed emails across the table. These came from a subpoena we filed last week. I skimmed through them. Most were conversations between Brian and his business partners. The messages started out confident enough. Everything's under control. No issues. The old man is out of the picture. Then the tone gradually shifted. Has anyone heard from him? Emily says he hasn't called. Do we know where he is? Something isn't right. Daniel tapped one particular email. This one was sent at 2:30 in the morning. I read it carefully. If Parker comes back before the permits are approved, we could have a serious problem. I looked at Daniel. He really wrote that? He did. So he's scared. Not yet. Daniel leaned forward. He's uncertain. There's a difference. A huge one. He folded his hands together. When guilty people know they're caught, they usually hire lawyers. And when they're uncertain, they make mistakes trying to figure out what everyone else knows. I nodded slowly. That made sense. Brian wasn't panicking because he thought he'd been exposed. He was panicking because he couldn't tell whether he had. Uncertainty was doing the work that confrontation never could. Over the following days, more information surfaced. The forged financial documents had been prepared months before I entered rehab. Several account transfers had been scheduled in advance. Brian hadn't acted on impulse. He'd been planning this long before I checked myself into treatment. The realization hit harder than I expected. All those family dinners. Holiday gatherings. Birthday parties. Every handshake. Every smile. Every conversation where he'd called me Dad. Behind all of it, he'd been waiting for the right opportunity. Not once had he seen me as family. He'd seen me as an investment. One Friday afternoon Daniel received a phone call while I was sitting across from him. He listened quietly for several minutes before hanging up. Then he looked at me with the calm expression I'd come to recognize. "We've got another witness." "Who?" "Brian's former accountant." I blinked. I didn't know he had one. "He doesn't anymore." "What happened?" "He resigned last year." "Why?" Daniel slid another folder across the table. He became uncomfortable with several transactions that didn't make sense. I opened it. Inside were handwritten notes, bank records, and copies of internal financial reports. The accountant had documented everything. Transfers between unrelated companies. Cash withdrawals. Property purchases made through shell corporations. Every page painted the same picture. Brian hadn't built his success. He'd financed it using money that belonged to other people. "This is incredible," I whispered. Daniel nodded. "It's also admissible." For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I could actually see the finish line. Not because we had one dramatic piece of evidence. Because we had dozens. Each document alone raised questions. Together they told an undeniable story. As I drove back to the apartment that evening, I realized something else had changed. I wasn't angry anymore. At least, not in the way I'd expected. The rage that had burned inside me after leaving rehab had slowly been replaced by something steadier. Resolve. Brian had stolen my savings. He'd manipulated my daughter. He'd counted on grief and addiction keeping me too broken to fight back. Instead, recovery had given me exactly what he hadn't planned for. Patience. Every sober day made me stronger. Every day of silence made him weaker. By the time he finally realized what was happening, the case against him would already be built. He still believed he was controlling the game. What he didn't understand was that the board had already changed. And he was the only player who hadn't noticed. By the time March rolled around, I'd been sober for nearly 3 months. That number meant more to me than I could explain. Years earlier, I would have celebrated it with a drink. The thought almost made me laugh now. Instead, I celebrated by keeping my promises to myself. Every morning started the same way. I got out of bed before sunrise, brewed a fresh pot of black coffee, and spent a few quiet minutes reading through the notebook I'd kept during rehab. It reminded me why I had chosen this path and what it had cost to get here. Daniel noticed the change too. "You carry yourself differently," he told me one morning. "Do I? You don't look like a man who's hiding anymore." I hadn't realized it until he said it. For years I'd walked through life with my shoulders slumped, avoiding eye contact, embarrassed by the person I'd become. That man was slowly disappearing. In his place was someone I actually recognized. One afternoon Daniel called and asked me to come to his office immediately. When I arrived, several maps and legal documents were spread across the conference table. He looked up with a small smile. "It's time." My heart skipped. "What happened?" "Our title objection has officially been accepted." I stared at him. "So now what?" "Now we wait for Brian to walk into the trap." He pointed toward a highlighted section on one of the maps. Months earlier, Brian had begun developing a commercial property on the north side of Indianapolis. Investors had already committed millions of dollars, contractors were preparing to break ground, and the city council was expected to approve the final permits within days. There was only one problem. A forgotten parcel of land sat directly in the middle of the project. It belonged to me. Years ago, Megan's father had left us that small piece of property. We'd never built anything on it or even talked about selling it. It simply sat there, untouched. Brian's legal team had somehow overlooked it. Without my signature, the entire development couldn't legally move forward. He still doesn't know? I asked. Daniel smiled. Not a clue. So what's the plan? You attend the council meeting. That's it? That's it. No speeches? No. No confrontation? Absolutely not. I couldn't help chuckling. I waited all these weeks for that. You waited all these weeks because patience wins cases. The meeting took place the following Wednesday evening at the city administration building. I bought myself a new wool coat that morning. Nothing expensive. Just something that fit well. Standing in front of the mirror before leaving the apartment, I barely recognized the man looking back at me. The lines on my face were still there. My hair was grayer. But my eyes were different. They were clear. Present. Alive. For the first time in years, I wasn't ashamed of the reflection staring back at me. When I arrived at the meeting, the room was already filling with business owners, city officials, contractors, and local residents. I slipped into a chair near the back. Daniel sat several rows closer to the front. Brian hadn't noticed either of us. Not yet. He was seated in the front row wearing an expensive navy suit, chatting confidently with two investors seated beside him. He looked relaxed. Comfortable. Like a man who believed everything was going according to plan. I watched him for several minutes. Then, almost instinctively, he glanced toward the back of the room. Our eyes met. Time seemed to stop. The smile disappeared from his face so quickly it almost looked painful. His shoulders stiffened. His expression drained of color. He blinked once. Then twice. As if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I simply looked back at him. Nothing more. Sometimes silence says everything words never could. Brian leaned toward one of his associates and whispered something. The man turned around, spotted me, and frowned. A moment later Brian pulled out his phone. No doubt he was trying to call someone. Probably Emily. Probably anyone who could explain why I was suddenly sitting in that room after disappearing for months. No one answered the questions racing through his mind. The meeting continued. Routine agenda items came and went until the council chair announced Brian's development proposal. He stood confidently and began presenting architectural drawings, projected tax revenue, and promises of economic growth. His voice sounded steady. But I could see the tension in his hands. He kept glancing toward the back of the room. Toward me. When he finished, the chairperson asked whether there were any legal objections before the council proceeded with its vote. Daniel stood. Every head in the room turned toward him. My name is Daniel Brooks, he said calmly. I represent Mr. Ethan Parker regarding a title dispute involving parcel 18B. Brian froze. Daniel continued without raising his voice. Public records confirm that the parcel remains under Mr. Parker's ownership. Since no lawful transfer has ever occurred, the proposed development cannot proceed until that issue is resolved. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Council members immediately began reviewing the documents Daniel handed them. The chairperson looked toward Brian. Mr. Mitchell, were you aware of this ownership issue? Brian opened his mouth. Closed it. Then cleared his throat. I'll need to speak with legal counsel. Very well, the chairperson replied. This proposal is postponed pending resolution of the title dispute. Her gavel tapped once. That was it. No shouting. No dramatic accusations. No scene. Just a single legal fact delivered at exactly the right moment. Months of planning unraveled in less than 2 minutes. As people gathered their belongings and conversations filled the room, I quietly stood up. Brian looked toward me again. This time there wasn't confidence in his eyes. Only fear. Real fear. I picked up my thermos, buttoned my coat, and walked toward the exit without saying a single word. Behind me, I could hear investors demanding answers. Lawyers were already gathering around Brian. Questions were coming from every direction. For the first time since I'd met him, he didn't have all the answers. Outside, the cool March air felt different than the January morning when I'd left rehab. Back then I believed I'd lost everything. Standing on those courthouse steps, I finally understood the truth. I hadn't lost my life. I'd taken it back. And Brian Mitchell had only begun to realize what that was going to cost him. The morning after the council meeting, I didn't wake up feeling victorious. That surprised me. For weeks I'd imagined what it might feel like when Brian's plans finally started falling apart. I thought I'd be excited or relieved, maybe even satisfied. Instead, I felt calm. The battle wasn't over. It had only entered a new stage. At exactly 8:30, Daniel called. "Turn on the local news." I picked up the remote and switched on the television. The lead story wasn't about me. It wasn't even about Brian. It was about the stalled development project. Reporters were talking about unexpected legal complications, disputed property ownership, and investors demanding answers after construction had been suspended indefinitely. Brian's name was mentioned several times. So was his company. I muted the television. "This is only the beginning, isn't it?" I asked. Daniel chuckled. "It is." "How bad is it for him?" "Worse than he realizes." He explained that once the title issue became public, several banks financing the project requested additional documentation. Investors wanted emergency meetings. Insurance companies began reviewing their exposure. One unanswered legal question had triggered a chain reaction. Everything Brian had built on borrowed credibility was beginning to shake. "He can't bluff his way through this," Daniel said. "No. He has to produce documents. And he doesn't have them." "Exactly." A few days later, Daniel invited me back to his office. When I arrived, another familiar face was waiting inside the conference room. A woman in her early 50s stood as I entered. She smiled politely. "You must be Ethan." "I am." She extended her hand. "I'm Laura Bennett." For a moment neither of us spoke. We didn't need introductions. We both knew why we were there. "I'm sorry we had to meet this way," she said. "So am I." We sat together while Daniel reviewed timelines, financial records, and witness statements. Listening to Laura describe what Brian had done to her family felt like hearing my own story told through someone else's voice. Different names. Different years. Same pattern. First came kindness. Then trust. Then control over financial decisions. Finally, the money disappeared. "He always made it seem temporary," Laura said quietly. "There was always an explanation." She looked down at her hands. "My father blamed himself until the day he died." The room became very still. Daniel waited before speaking. "That won't happen again." Laura nodded. "I've waited nearly 10 years to hear someone say that." Over the following month, everything accelerated. State investigators requested documents. Banks froze several of Brian's business accounts. Former employees began contacting Daniel voluntarily after hearing rumors that an investigation was underway. One contractor admitted he'd been instructed to alter invoices. A former office manager turned over email archives she'd saved before resigning. Even Brian's longtime financial advisor hired separate legal counsel. One by one, the people who had protected him began protecting themselves instead. The walls were closing in. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Emily's number. I froze. Daniel had warned me this day would come. I answered on the second ring. "Hi, sweetheart." Silence. I could hear her breathing. Then came the sound of quiet crying. "Dad." Just one word. It carried months of confusion, guilt, heartbreak, and relief all at once. "I'm here," I said softly. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." "He told me." Her voice cracked again. "He said you asked for more time at rehab. Then he said you stopped answering because you'd started drinking again." I closed my eyes. "I never stopped believing in you," she whispered. Tears filled my own eyes. "You never had a reason not to." "I'm so sorry." "No." I interrupted gently. "You don't apologize for someone else's lies." She cried openly now. The kind of crying that comes after carrying too much for far too long. "I should have come looking for you. You trusted your husband. I trusted the wrong person. You trusted the man who promised to love you." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. "I've left him," she finally said. Those 4 words settled quietly between us. "I'm staying with a friend." "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Good." I didn't know who else to call. "You'll always call me." We talked for nearly 2 hours. Not once did we argue. Not once did we talk about blame. Instead, we talked about healing. About Megan. About recovery. About starting over. When we finally hung up, I realized something important. Getting my money back mattered. Holding Brian accountable mattered. But neither of those victories compared to hearing my daughter laugh again before ending the call. A week later, Daniel walked into my apartment carrying a familiar smile. "It's over." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "Brian accepted a plea agreement." I stared at him. "No trial." He knew the evidence was overwhelming. Daniel handed me the official paperwork. Brian had pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud, forgery, financial exploitation, and related financial crimes. Restitution orders had already been approved. Assets would be liquidated. Properties sold. Accounts recovered wherever possible. Justice hadn't arrived with flashing lights or dramatic courtroom speeches. It had arrived through patient preparation, careful documentation, and the truth. Months earlier, I'd walked out of rehab carrying less than $50 and a dead phone. Now I was holding court documents proving that the man who believed I'd never fight back had underestimated the quiet strength that recovery had given me. The greatest victory wasn't watching Brian lose. It was realizing that I hadn't. For the first time in years, my future no longer belonged to my grief, my addiction, or the man who had tried to exploit both. It belonged to me. The legal case was finally behind us, but I quickly realized that winning in court didn't magically put life back together. Some things couldn't be repaired with paperwork. Some things had to be rebuilt one conversation at a time. Emily stopped by the apartment the following Saturday carrying 2 large coffees and a paper bag from the little bakery her mother used to love. When I opened the door, we stood there for a second, both unsure whether to hug or speak first. She solved it by wrapping her arms around me. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find my way back," she whispered. I hugged her just as tightly. "You're here now," I said. "That's what matters." We spent the morning talking over cinnamon rolls that had already gone cold because neither of us remembered to eat them. Instead of focusing on Brian, we talked about Megan. We laughed about the time she'd accidentally locked herself out of the house wearing gardening gloves and somehow convinced the mailman to help her climb through a kitchen window. Emily laughed so hard she had tears in her eyes. "I haven't thought about that in years." "Your mom would have laughed even harder." She always did. For the first time since Megan passed away, remembering her didn't feel like reopening a wound. It felt like bringing someone we both loved back into the room for a little while. As spring settled over Indianapolis, Daniel kept me updated on the financial recovery process. Not every dollar could be traced. Not every investment survived. But far more had been recovered than either of us expected. The court-appointed receiver did excellent work, Daniel explained one afternoon. Several properties have already been sold, and more funds are coming back every month. I never thought I'd see any of it again. Neither did Brian. I smiled. That's his problem now. Daniel nodded. I've noticed something. What's that? You don't ask about him anymore. He was right. Months earlier I'd wanted to know every detail of Brian's downfall. Now I hardly thought about him. My attention had shifted somewhere far more important. My own future. One evening Emily invited me over for dinner. Walking into the house felt strange. So many memories lived inside those walls. Some beautiful. Some painful. She had rearranged the furniture. Painted the living room. Taken down every reminder of Brian. The place felt lighter somehow. Halfway through dinner she looked at me across the table. I've been thinking about Mom. I usually am. You remember how she always wanted a place where people could go when they had nowhere else? I smiled immediately. She talked about that for years. It was never supposed to be fancy. No. Just comfortable. Emily reached into her purse and unfolded a notebook. I've been making plans. Inside were pages filled with sketches, budgets, volunteer lists, and handwritten ideas. A recovery community, she said. Not a hospital. Not rehab. A place where people finishing treatment could find support before they had to face the world alone. My eyes stayed on the notebook. You've been working on this. 4 weeks. She hesitated. I was hoping you'd help me. I looked up. I'd be honored. Daniel became involved almost immediately. He handled the legal paperwork, helped establish the nonprofit organization, and connected us with people willing to donate supplies and professional services. Word spread faster than any of us expected. Former clients from my construction days volunteered to renovate the building we'd found. Local businesses donated furniture. A coffee company agreed to supply fresh coffee every month. Retired counselors offered to lead weekly support groups without charging a dime. Watching complete strangers give their time reminded me of something Megan used to say. Kindness always travels farther than we think. She'd been right. By early autumn, the building was ready. It wasn't large. There were no marble floors or expensive decorations. Just a welcoming lobby, a community kitchen, a meeting room filled with folding chairs, a small library, and a quiet garden behind the building. It felt exactly the way Megan would have wanted. Warm. Simple. Honest. On opening day, more than 100 people came. Neighbors. Friends. Recovery counselors. Former patients. Even Laura drove in with her children to attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony. She hugged Emily before finding me. Your wife would have been proud, she said. I hope so. I know so. Daniel stood nearby wearing the same calm smile I'd seen the day he picked me up outside Pine Ridge Recovery Center. You remember sleeping in our guest room? I asked him. I'll never forget it. Megan would have loved seeing this. He looked around the crowded room before answering. This place exists because she opened one door for a scared kid 25 years ago. I swallowed hard. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness take decades before you understand what they truly became. As the first support meeting began that evening, I quietly slipped into the back row. A young man introduced himself. He'd been sober for 9 days. A woman across the circle admitted she'd nearly skipped the meeting because she was embarrassed to ask for help. An older gentleman confessed that he hadn't spoken honestly about his addiction in over 20 years. Nobody judged. Nobody interrupted. Everyone simply listened. I realized then that recovery wasn't really about leaving your past behind. It was about making sure someone else didn't have to face theirs alone. I looked at the framed photograph of Megan hanging on the far wall. For the first time since losing her, I didn't feel like she was missing. I felt like her kindness had simply taken on a new shape. And somehow, it was still changing lives. Nearly a year had passed since the morning I walked out of Pine Ridge Recovery Center carrying a dead phone, a worn wallet, and less than $50 in my pocket. Sometimes I still thought about that day. Not because it hurt anymore, but because it reminded me how quickly life can change. Back then, I believed I was completely alone. I couldn't have been more wrong. Every morning I settled into the same routine. I'd fill my old thermos with black coffee, drive to the recovery center before anyone else arrived, unlock the front door, and spend a few quiet minutes enjoying the silence before the day began. Those moments became my favorite part of every day. The chairs would still be stacked. The coffee hadn't started brewing. The hallways were empty. It gave me time to think. People often asked whether I hated Brian. For a while, I probably did. But hatred is heavy. I'd already carried enough weight for one lifetime. Recovery taught me that forgiveness isn't pretending someone didn't hurt you. It isn't excusing what they did, and it certainly doesn't mean allowing them back into your life. Sometimes forgiveness simply means refusing to let another person's choices control your future. Brian was held accountable. The court ordered restitution, his business collapsed, and he faced the legal consequences of every decision he'd made. That was justice's job. Mine was different. My job was learning how to live again. Emily and I grew closer than we'd been in years. Every Sunday morning she stopped by with coffee, and we'd sit on the small bench behind the center before anyone else arrived. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. We discovered we didn't always need words. Just being together was enough. One spring afternoon she smiled and said, "Mom would have loved this place." I looked around at the people laughing on the patio, volunteers carrying boxes of donated food inside, and a support group gathering under the shade trees. "I think she's been part of it from the beginning," I answered. Emily nodded without saying another word. She understood exactly what I meant. Daniel eventually joined us on those Sunday mornings too. Even after everything was finished, he never disappeared from our lives. One day I asked him something I'd wondered about for months. "Why did you come looking for me?" He looked out across the garden before answering. "Because 25 years ago your family saved mine." I frowned. "We only gave you a place to stay." He smiled. "You gave me dignity." I didn't know what to say. He continued. "When I walked into your house all those years ago, I thought I was a burden. Your wife never treated me that way. She handed me clean towels, made me a home-cooked meal, and acted like she'd been expecting me all along." He laughed quietly. That changed the way I saw myself. I remembered Megan doing exactly that. She never asked whether someone deserved kindness. She simply gave it. Daniel looked at me. "I've spent my career helping people because your wife showed me what compassion looked like." Those words stayed with me for a long time. It's funny how one ordinary decision can echo across decades. Megan never imagined that making an extra plate for dinner or preparing a guest room would someday come back to protect our family. She wasn't trying to earn anything. She was simply living the way she believed people should treat one another. That's the lesson I carry now. The world keeps score in ways we rarely notice. Every act of generosity plants something. Sometimes it grows quickly. Sometimes it takes years. But it almost always grows. Today the center is full almost every evening. Some people stay for an hour. Others stay until closing because they aren't ready to go home yet. The coffee is always fresh. The chairs are rarely empty. And every newcomer who walks through our doors is greeted the same way Megan greeted people in our home years ago, with warmth, respect, and the quiet assurance that they belong. Near the entrance hangs a small wooden plaque. It doesn't mention court cases or stolen money. It doesn't celebrate victories over dishonest people. Instead, it reads: in loving memory of Megan Parker, a woman who always made room for one more chair at the table, one more cup of coffee, and one more chance to begin again. Whenever I read those words, I smile. Not because they erase the hard years. Nothing ever will. I smile because they remind me that my story isn't really about betrayal. It isn't about fraud. It isn't even about recovery. It's about choosing what kind of person you'll become after life gives you every reason to quit. I lost my wife. I nearly lost my daughter. I almost lost myself. Yet somehow, through honesty, patience, and the kindness of people who refused to give up on me, I found my way back. If there's one thing I hope anyone takes from my story, it's this. Never assume your life is over because you're standing in a lonely parking lot. Sometimes the hardest chapter is only the beginning of a much better one. Keep asking for help. Keep showing up. Keep believing that tomorrow can look different from today. You never know whose life you're changing with a simple act of compassion, or how that kindness might one day find its way back to you. And every single morning, as I sit outside the center with my thermos of black coffee and watch the sun climb over the trees, I'm reminded that hope doesn't usually arrive with fireworks or grand speeches. More often, it arrives quietly. One honest conversation. One steady hand. One fresh start. At a time. That's more than enough for me.